Hi, welcome to episode 22 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we are using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. If you enjoy listening, please subscribe on whatever platform you're using, give us a like in this particular episode, and check us out on Instagram at American Tributaries Podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Kara van de Kieft. Kara is a doctor of diagnostic radiology who recently retired after 21 years of service in the United States Air Force, and she's now in private practice. Kara and I know each other through her husband, Mike, who I've known since, I think, long before I could walk. Kara lives in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm really thrilled to have her on. Kara, thanks so much for joining me today, and thank you for all those years of service. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Mike.
Oh, thank you. I was just thinking as I was preparing to come on that I'm pretty sure we met each other like when you and Mike, before you had even started your active duty. So it's hard to believe that here we are talking on the other end where you've retired.
Well, yeah. So I think I came on active duty. I graduated from medical school in 2001. So June of 2001, and I came on active duty on 1 July when I started my residency. And I actually started out in general surgery, and and that was in San Antonio. And I was an active duty military resident. And so I met Michael my second year of residency in the ICU at Wilford Hall. And so that would have been around 2002, 2003 when we hooked up. And so so I had already started my military career at that point, and then I went kind of through this transition period where I decided that I didn't want to do general surgery, and I switched into radiology. I decided, well, I would prefer to do this specialty, and so I made a change. I resigned from my residency program, and then I was a general medical officer for about 18 months before I started training in my diagnostic radiology residency.
Okay. When you were, I guess, when did you make the decision that you wanted to be involved be a military doctor, and how did you decide on becoming an Air Force doctor?
Well, so I followed my brother into the Air Force. He and we went to college in San Antonio at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And, he was in the ROTC program. And so he and I were also roommates in college. And so everybody that I hung out with in college was in that ROTC program. And so I think, if you had told me when I graduated from high school that I was going to spend, 21 years in the military, I would have said, no way. Like that's just not like, I never saw myself as like a military serving person. And so, but then when I was in college, I had decided when I was a freshman that I wanted to go to medical school. And then, of course, anybody who goes to medical school, you have to figure out a way to pay for medical school. And so, when I was hanging out with all of these ROTC kids, they're just like, I began to realize these are just like normal people. These are people just like me, and so it just didn't. And then at that point, it was like, well, they have this, there's a couple of different ways that you can be a physician in the military. You can do a program called the Health Professions Scholarship Program, which you join before you start medical school. Or you can go to the Uniformed Services Medical School, which is located in Washington, D.C., and then you can go to that, and you're actually on active duty during medical school. You join whatever branch of choice. There are people there who are in the Air Force. They have Army medical students there, Navy, and so that's another pathway. But so what I did was I decided to do the health profession scholarship program. So I basically, joined the Air Force right after I graduated from college. The summer before I started medical school is when I went to officer training school, and then after that, I was basically, I went to medical school at Texas A&M, so that I was basically like a civilian during medical school, but then I came on active duty when I completed my training, my medical school training, and then I started residency. So, and that was kind of the timeline for that. So as far as like, the clock as far as, counting towards retirement starts when you come on active duty.
Mhm.
So, yeah. So, I mean, in hindsight, at the beginning of your career, it seems like, oh, this is going to drag on forever. And even at the beginning, I wasn't really sure if I was going to stay, past, my commitment, for my educational commitment. But I sort of, everybody asks you, oh, like, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? And I'm sort of like, I always joke in the Air Force, or in the military, when you're serving in the military, you really have to kind of take it one day at a time, one email at a time.
I think that's like
So
out in the
that's,
civilian world too.
yeah. So yeah, again, and again, it's funny you mentioned that, because it really is like, no matter if you're working for the government, or you're, the Department of Defense, or any other department of whatever, or if you're working for a civilian company, like, you think, well, I don't have any freedom, if I'm in the military. You don't really have a lot of freedom per se, when you're working for any other corporation, for that matter. So it's like, you have to kind of figure out, uh, who you want to work for,
Right.
so, but
I-
for the most part, I mean, I don't have any regrets about any of the choices that I have made. So,
were there any moments where you were just where it felt like, I mean, when I was only in the Navy for 4 years, but like, I'd say like for the first year, like living out in Japan, there was like some serious, like, kind of, I don't know if I'd say I was like like missing home. I was homesick, but they just felt something like very almost like unnatural a little bit. So like, was there a while where you were just like, this doesn't feel right, and then it felt right, or did it just kind of feel right from the beginning?
well, I think there's always times, like, whenever you kind of doubt the choices that you're making. I mean, I think for me, I always felt like, I had a handle on what I was doing until I got into like my general surgery training, and I was like, uh, this is not really, I think, the best thing for me to do in the long term. And so just kind of having the guts, because to sort of change directions, that was something that was very hard for me. But there was never, and then it was like, there was some things about being in the military where it's not like, where you're in the civilian world and you can just try to go immediately find another residency. So that was kind of a complicating factor. But I think in hindsight, when you look back on it, it's like you can kind of see how all the pieces sort of fell into place. And you just, I think if you're kind of true to whatever it is that you feel like you need to do for yourself, but then also try to work within the system, you can kind of get to the other side, so to speak. And so I think there wasn't, the only other time in my career where it was like, it's when it's probably, I would say, when I got deployed and I had to, like, leave my family for, 6 months, or, 4 or 5 months. Um, like when the government comes to collect their, the debt, that you have said, because up to that point, I would say, in terms of, like, training and assignments, I had basically gotten whatever I wanted, like, it was all very working out in my, yeah, I had never been asked to really do something that, because nobody wants to leave their family for 6 months. But, and a lot of people try like heck to get out of doing it. But that was a moment where I was like, well, this is really what it's about. Like, that you've gotten something and now you're going to have to, give back, for that. So I think there was, but again, people, if it's about being resilient, and most of us going outside of your comfort zone. And that was one of the most memorable and things that I did, as part of my time in the Air Force. So I'm glad that I did it. And my brother, like I said, he was in the military, in the Air Force as well, and he deployed multiple times. And so you can always, look around and find somebody who's had a more difficult road to travel. So, that kind of helps you, like, okay, snap out of it. This is not about me. This is about, what I'm supposed to be doing, in my career and in my job and in service, to the Air Force. So, yeah.
What was that? May I ask what that first deployment was?
It was to Qatar. I mean, people joke that Qatar, like going to Qatar is like going on a vacation. But when I go on vacation, I take my family with me. So I don't really, I mean, it's Qatar is, and things have changed a little bit. It was interesting because I went there right before we started having problems with ISIS. That was in like 2014, and you could go off base, and which I did quite a bit, and it was a lot more of it was more of like a TDY than, you weren't like in a war zone. So so in Qatar is basically, it's like a, it's something, even though we pulled out of Afghanistan, we still have a presence in the Middle East. And that is like one of the, probably the largest, location in terms of like concentration of, troops that are still there. And we still operate out of that, area that never really went away. And so, but, and I suspect we'll probably still, be there for a long period of time, because, as they say, Qatar is like kind of like the Switzerland of the Middle East. At least that's what they try to be. So.
Mm-hmm. What's a deployment, like, as a doctor? What are you doing when you're deployed overseas? Is there like a rotation of like specialists, and that was like your turn, or was there?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so, basically, you just do your job that you would do at home, and except you're the only person that's doing it. And sometimes you cover other places, remotely cover, in Qatar, a lot of the stuff that we were seeing was just like, things that we would take care of, at home. People get appendicitis when they're deployed. People get injured. We had a lot of, people who, like you ride bikes around. Like a lot of people get around base by riding bicycles. They, crash their bike, or, they'd get into they'd have some kind of, people like repetitive use injuries from working out too much, things like that, things that you see with like people who have, not, like super sick people, but, people do, just the general spectrum of illness and disease that, people can develop, so that's now, if you were in a place like Afghanistan, or a place where, Michael deployed to, like, people are getting, shot, blown up. It's a much more, there's a lot more critical care going on there. So that it just totally depends on where you're operating.
And is it totally random, or do you get to request where you'd like to be deployed to if
No,
that
you
comes
don't
up?
get to. No, you get a somebody. Your commander decides, and that generally speaking, depending on, there is a consultant who tries to kind of keep track of who's gone and how. And this is just for like typically within like the medical field. Now, on the line, like on the, kind of the line side of things, it would be, it would be different. Um, but they kind of know who has gone and who hasn't gone and whose turn is it next. And so typically when you're trying to it's usually, if it's your turn to go, then you're, unless there's some reason you can't go to a particular location, then that's you're up.
Mhm.
It's your turn. So pack your bags, you're going. So
It's funny. I guess, like, I mean, again, I only did 4 years in service, but I think one of the things that maybe I've only started to realize now is that one of the differences, I think, between, like, if you have the military background versus if you've never had the military background and you're just a civilian, is the idea of, like, sometimes you just got to do it. Like, sometimes you don't get to do what you want to do.
exactly. Yes.
And I think,
Yeah.
and I guess it's a privilege to be a civilian who's never been put in that position. But, like, when you're in the military, and they're sometimes like, yeah, no, you're going here, sorry, like, that's it. Like,
Yes.
there's no
Yeah.
protest, there's no nothing. That's your job.
Yes, exactly. And everybody, I think I think it helps to kind of think about it in terms of, these are all skill sets that, help you to just survive in general in life. But, again, a lot of it is about being resilient and realizing, and if you have the ability to kind of look around and you have an attitude of, and it's kind of cheesy gratitude, but because you can always look around and find somebody who is probably has a tougher road to walk than you do. So if you're capable of doing that, then I think that you know you're going to last longer for starters if you're willing, because I think there's a point of like it's basically about being able to can you delay gratification to or develop a plan in terms of like, okay, I have to go do this thing, but here are the reasons why I should do it. Number one, this is part of the reason why the military exists in the first place. And then is to when you've been asked to go do something that is in defense of the country, then you do it. It's like that's what you're there for. But also, if you can figure out, okay, if I can just get through this, then this will help me, in my career. And certainly, a lot of these things that you're asked to do are also tied to career progression. So if you're wanting to, progress in your career, then you do have to do these things. And some people love to deploy and some people don't, and so you have people that, there's pros and cons, with everything. So, but, I think, the thing about the military is that it's very, it's like it takes all kinds, each branch is different. And I think that, one of the things that I would say is that if you're thinking about being in the military, you have to realize that, it does take a full commitment to doing it. And but it is something that I have no regrets doing, even though like way back when in high school, it still amazes me to this day that, that's the direction that I went in. It was like absolutely like the best thing for me, I feel like. But at that being said, if you have kind of have a plan, and I wanted to stay in until I retired, I could retire. Uh but I wasn't gonna, and it's something that's like a very comfortable situation, but then I also felt like it was time for me to do something else
Mm-hmm.
and retire. So
Mm.
because again, there's no growth that occurs inside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
So
But I was thinking that for people in the military, there are a few jobs where you can go to the civilian side and have kind of like the same like kind of responsibility, like the same work setting, but then also have it be very different. So like for you as a, because like for most, if you're like when I at least picturing like Navy jobs or most of the jobs, it's like it's combat oriented, or there's certain equipment that's specific to the military that you work on, so you can translate it over to the civilian world, but it's
mhm,
not necessarily
like
exactly
a
the
one
same.
for one.
Yeah, but like it seems like as a doctor, even more like even more so than like a lawyer or other of those kind of those professions that need like that graduate degree, you're really kind of able to kind of see the differences. So like, what when now being in the civilian world, are there any like I guess what differences? I mean, obviously, I would imagine the salary is higher, but as far as like how things operate or anything, has it how has that been?
Well, I mean, I think it's certainly the biggest difference in the civilian world is that I have noticed is that there is, you know, if I would, look at a patient's exam and make a recommendation about like another test, like for example, um, oh, this person, they get a CT scan and I see something in their liver and I think that they, well, they need another test, like maybe an MRI or something. That's like hugely expensive in the civilian world, and it is at the same, it costs the same to operate an MRI machine in the military setting as it does in the civilian setting, and so there's more of a, you start to have to think about like patients' ability to pay for these things that you're recommending, and so that has really been like something that has been an adjustment for me. Like in the military, if you recommend something, then generally speaking, we don't have to worry about our patient's ability to pay for that thing that you're recommending. Or if you do a biopsy on someone, if I do a breast biopsy on someone and it comes back as a cancer, then a lot of the patients that I'm doing biopsies on, they uh, do they're lower income individuals that may not have health insurance. So it's really, that's where you kind of have to figure out, okay, you worry like, are these patients going to be able to get the care that they need? Whereas in the military, when where it's basically a single payer system, you don't have to worry about that. Somebody's paying for it, and that's been a big issue for, I mean, over the years, it's like we're one of the most costly departments, like, military medicine in general, and like the VA, and the, providing healthcare it's an expensive proposition. So, um, so that has been the thing that's been probably, I mean, yes, you're right, I do get paid a lot, significantly more, but I also do, I work more, I am working, like my productivity is much higher, than it would be, in terms of what was going on when I was in the military. And I was having also, when you get to be higher up in the ranks, you have to start doing other administrative related things, which, kind of takes you away from the work of being, a radiologist, but, or a physician. But, but in private practice, you're doing radiology, and that's pretty much what you're doing, unless you're in some kind of like leadership position, either in your group or in a hospital setting. So, So that's been, I think, good for me. I think it's kind of helping me to sort of reacquire some skills that I had kind of like gotten rusty, on. So, and that's why a lot of people do eventually get out of, retire, move on, especially physicians, because like, you want to focus solely on, um, the medicine side of things as opposed to the administrative side of things.
Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly you do as a radiologist?
Yeah, so I am a general diagnostic radiologist, and I have an interest in women's imaging and cardiac imaging, and so I do a lot of procedures related to women's imaging. Doing breast biopsies, and I read mammograms. A lot of screening mammograms when women have like symptoms, that might be concerning for breast cancer. Then I see those patients in a clinic, look at their imaging, and then determine whether or not they need a biopsy. And then we do the biopsy, and then we kind of coordinate their care from there with the surgeon. And so that's part of what I do. But then I also read just general diagnostic imaging, X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, I work typically from 8 to 5, and and I do all of those. I may, depending on what the schedule calls for, I may do more women's imaging, or I might do a mix of women's imaging and general diagnostic radiology. Or some days when we don't have patients in the mammography clinic, then I'll just do all general diagnostic imaging.
Wow. And is there, I guess, so how many different types of like imaging is there for you that you're dealing with? You mentioned X-rays, you mentioned
Yeah,
MRI.
so like there's X-rays, there's CT scans, MRI, and you can image any part of the body that you want to. There is those are the main. Ultrasound, that's another modality, and that was developed by the Navy. It's funny,
Yeah.
there's a connection there.
Yeah.
And that technology was developed, but it was adopted into medical imaging.
Mhm.
And then nuclear medicine is another facet of radiology, which there there's that used to be its own separate training program, and then it's kind of been combined with radiology training. And then there's an area of radiology, interventional radiologists. Those are people who do mostly procedures, but uh, so that's those are basically all the modalities that you're dealing with.
Mhm.
So it's it's a fairly comprehensive uh, uh, specialty. I think radiology it's someone once said we're kind of like the doctor's doctor. You know but we also do we all we do is look at images all day, so it's like you're looking for sort of like clues to what is ailing the patient. And typically when a patient, like if you go to the ER and you're having abdominal pain, so typically what'll happen is that or say you like smashed your finger or something like that, you're likely not to get out of that visit without having some type of imaging done. So it's sort of like they're supposed to do an H&P, decide what lab work that they want to order if necessary, and then whoever's taking care of you in the ED would then like order imaging, to make a diagnosis of whatever your problem might be. So we're kind of behind the scenes in a dark room staring at a computer screen with all your images. So, we see through you, so we don't necessarily always see the patient's face, but we do have an encounter with patients. It's it's a virtual encounter, but that's basically what I do. That's what that looks like. That's what being a radiologist, actually translates to in the real world. So
I mean, I guess so. A little bit. It sounds like some like one of those like kind of picture problems where it's like, what do you see here, or what
it's like
are the difference
sometimes
between
it can be like a Where's Waldo,
Yeah.
Especially if you're like looking and you're like, I don't see anything wrong with this person. Those are
Right.
like the people that you have to watch out for,
Mhm.
because then, you don't want to miss anything significant,
Right.
or so because everything is obvious in hindsight.
Right.
So
And I guess the big difference is that, I mean, the buck stops with you. Like it's your assessment of that picture. Like if you miss something,
exactly.
that's you, and that's the difference between like somebody thinking like, well, I'll just look at the picture, I can see what the wrong is. Like, no, you don't. There's so much more that goes into
Yeah,
it, but at the end of the day, it's all of your expertise and education and training and experience that
right.
helps you decide.
Exactly. And obviously, like the longer you do it, you do get better at it.
Mhm.
It's like the world's like most important game of pattern recognition
Yeah.
that you'll ever play.
Wow.
And but I think if you, and you do get better at it the more you do. It's
Mhm.
it really, that is definitely true.
Mhm.
If you don't have a comparison, imaging, comparison exam, like if you're like a young radiologist and you see something, you're like, I see something here, I don't know what this is. You
Mhm.
don't have a comparison
Mhm.
exam, then go find an old radiologist. So
Mhm.
that's the general teaching anyway. So find somebody with more experience who can, kind of help you out. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, thinking, I think we had talked about this when I last saw you, but I guess going back to that Kara in high school, your your life took a number of different turns, being then and now you're a retired colonel in the Air Force, married to a guy from Long Island,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
you have like lots of familiarity with now.
Yes. Well, I mean, I certainly didn't think, I was, I was born and raised in Texas, and I always thought I would marry somebody from Texas, but,
Mhm.
so it wasn't, I guess, what I would say there is that don't expect, the person that I wound up with was not anybody that I ever thought that I would wind up with, but he's a lot like, I like to joke, we kind of joke with each other, and I think probably other people make a joke of it too, is that we're sort of like the male and female version of each other, so for better or for worse. And
Mhm.
so I never really thought that I would wind up with somebody, from Long Island. But there's a lot of people who live on Long Island that are very similar to people that live in Texas. So,
Mhm.
the kind of in keeping with the theme of this, what you're doing here is that people think that they're really different, depending on where they live in this country, and that's one of the things that you learn in the military, is that you meet people from all over the place, and you realize that, like, oh, these people are, they're, you're kind of thrown into this thing. And that's one of the things that is great about serving in the military, is that it does bring you together with people who are not, who you would never like select on your own necessarily to be acquaintances, but you kind of come together around this common goal, whatever your mission is, whatever you're there for, whatever you've been, whatever you signed up for to do, and you have to make it work. And so it's so for that reason, and that's kind of what happened with me and Michael is, I like, met him, and I was like, oh, well, this isn't what I was really looking for, but this is actually, I think, probably what I need, just in
Hmm.
terms of a partner. And so, yeah, I mean, this is how, I think when you're young and you're kind of like, you have to be willing to be flexible, and that is one of the things that I've always, it's kind of cheesy, but there's this saying in the air, the Air Force, flexibility is the key to air power. Well, I would say flexibility is the key to everything. I mean, when you really think about it, the people who are able to kind of survive are the ones who are willing to be flexible. So,
Yeah, yeah. Um, you when you met you refer to Texas, and I think like for being in New York, I've been there. I visited you guys. I've visited in Austin once. The word Texas seems like monolithic. Like you just hear Texas, like okay, everybody from Texas is the same way,
yeah.
and usually based on whatever caricature you might have, right? But obviously, I'm sure Texas is not that. So, like, how do you explain Texas to people?
Well,
If that's
I,
even possible with whatever little
so,
time we might have
so
left.
if you think about just the geographic size of Texas, it's almost like it's like several, states in one, And I remember when I was interviewing for medical school, um, I had decided that I wanted to stay in Texas because, initially, like I didn't really have a plan for, it's very inexpensive to go. At least, I mean, I don't know what it's like now. It's probably more expensive, but if you're an in-state resident, the state, you know, to go to a state school, either a university or medical school, if you're a resident, it's very inexpensive, or at least it was at the time. Like, my parents are originally from Colorado, and I remember at some point coming across like a tuition bill for my cousin who was going to the University of Colorado, and it was like my eyes practically popped out of my head, and so for a lot of people like living in Colorado, it's cheaper to go to an out of state school than it is to actually go to school in their own state. So I was interviewing at all the schools in Texas, and I was on a flight to interview at Texas Tech University, which is in Lubbock, which is like, it's about at least a solid, you know, 7 or 8 hour drive from Corpus Christi. And, you know, the guy asked me, who was sitting next to me, he asked me, he was like, well, he kind of has he had the typical, Texas, accent. And he asked me, he's like, well, where are you from? And I was like, I'm from Texas. I grew up in Corpus Christi. And he was like, he's like, he didn't believe me because I didn't sound like him,
Uh-huh.
and um, so that was, so it's not like a monolith. It's definitely not. And politically, I mean, like, you know, it's there's a lot of different people in Texas. We have Democrats in Texas, we do, and then we have Republicans, and so it's definitely, and then you have people who are, independents, it's like any other place in terms of, the, up to this point, historically, the Republicans have dominated in terms of the politics, but as like that, it's, like that's how it is in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. I mean, there are conservative, people in other places too. It's just that, Texas gets a lot of play because it's a big state, so, but it's certainly not, uh, I was thinking about, being in New York and how multicultural New York is. Well, Houston is very similar. to New York, and yesterday the weather was also very similar. So I actually was walking around, and thinking, oh wow, this is kind of like as hot as it is in Texas, and so, but it's much cooler today. So
Yeah.
um, so that's good.
And you guys had a nice string of like 100-degree days, I think, earlier in the summer,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. So there is definitely, like starting Mother's Day weekend, it was 100 degrees on Mother's Day weekend, which, that is definitely an outlier, and then like June was the same. There were maybe a few days when we were under 100, but, and I've been checking the weather, kind of just seeing, and it seems like it's actually a little cooler in August, which is not really typically the case. Usually August is our hot month, not, June and July. But yeah, I mean, we've basically been having we're back in a drought, drought conditions. And we had a drought about 10 years ago, like in 2011, 2012. But it is hotter, than I mean, I've been living in Texas for 47 years. So
Mhm.
at least for the last 47 years, it hasn't been this hot in the summertime.
Really?
So yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
So
And
when it's
I think that's actually, a true statement. So,
so one of the things, like I guess in New York, that can make it feel hotter is that you oftentimes have to like walk around on the streets. Like you
yes.
have to get from here to the subway, then you've got to sit on the subway, which I think, as far as hell on earth, like being on some subway platforms in the middle of a hot summer day,
Yeah.
steamy, stinky, lots of people, sweaty, no relief. Like I
Yeah.
don't know if there's a hotter place in the country, but like in Texas, when you're having that string of 100-degree days, are people just kind of living in air conditioning, or does it just become oppressive? I mean, how do people respond to that kind of just constant heat day after day after
Yeah.
day?
Well, I mean, I think that they find a pool, or, they, if you're outside, you're generally in a swimming pool or at a beach or something. And or, you're inside all day long in central air conditioning working, like
Mhm.
that's how, that's the difference between, like, Texas, San Antonio, the hill country, kind of the area where I live, is on the same latitude as Egypt.
Mhm.
So, and that really, like the Edwards Plateau, that area that's really kind of like a desert like environment. And so, we have central air conditioning like that. I mean, I grew up with that. Like, that's what you do. Like in other places, like here, I remember when I first came up to Long Island to meet Michael's parents for the first time, I was like shocked that there was like no, it was in the summertime, and I was like, God, it's really humid here, which is how it is, again, Texas being a big state, there is some difference in some of the, regional climate is a little different. And when you're on the coast, living on an island or close to an island, it's much more humid. And so I was surprised that like his parents didn't have AC in their house, like central AC, because I'm like, what is this, like window AC units? This is like, so like you guys are, like you need like central AC. It's like, that's how you get rid of the humidity in your house, and um, so it's that was kind of, different. But that's how, I used to, we used to spend a lot of time in Colorado in the summertime, and there's no, for the most part, most houses did not have, that are in these kind of cooler climates don't have that as a feature of their buildings. So um you know I assume that some of the newer construction in New York, I mean, I haven't, they have central AC, like some
Yeah.
of these old buildings, everybody has a window AC unit, like the hotel that we're staying in, it's a window, every place has its own, personal AC unit, but which has worked just fine for me. But yeah, it's definitely like the weather sort of sets the tone, for what infrastructure, you have going for you. But I have noticed that, for about 5 years ago, his parents, had central AC put in to their house. So because it has gotten, a little warmer, as time
Yeah,
has
yeah.
gone by. So
um, I had a friend on the podcast once who was from Wyoming, living there, and he made these two comments, which was interesting, kind of insights into both his area and in New York. So I was wondering if you had any analogies like similar to this. Like the two things he had said was, one, he's like, Wyoming and New York actually have something really fundamentally in common, is you can do whatever you want, because in Wyoming it's so spread out that nobody will notice what you're doing, and he's like, in New York nobody cares. So like while people in Wyoming and New York think that they're very different, he's like, in both areas you just go to do what you want to do because you'll never be noticed. But then he had drawn the contrast between the two areas, saying like, in New York, there is a like a certain, I guess, like racial diversity that you don't see in Wyoming for sure. But he said in Wyoming there is like a class diversity that you don't have in New York, because in Wyoming, there's not enough people to kind of have like select schools for rich people versus poor people. So you'll have like the
yeah,
ditch digger going to the same school as the kid whose father is like the CEO of the bank. So
yeah.
those are two, like for me, like just epiphanies into understanding a different area. Since you've been straddling both New York and Texas for so long, are there things that you see in both worlds where you're like, people are missing the boat here on the differences or on the similarities? Like, what's your observations?
Well, I mean, I personally think that there are probably more things, in common, like, than there are different between, Texas and New York. Especially, I mean, if you live in, the only difference between the real difference between the two is the availability of land. There's just so much land, and I think you have more options. Even, I mean, yes, some people have escaped the city and gone out, to, the suburbs of Long Island and of Connecticut and upstate New York. Uh, but in terms of like the actual cities themselves, even Dallas, which seems like more of like, I think it's probably stereotypically considered to be like, the big D, kind of more, of a red city. It's a very diverse city. San Antonio, Houston, all the big, Austin. I mean, Austin's probably, the big difference is, with, I just think with New York, there's no other city that has as many people. The density,
Yeah.
the density is unrivaled in terms of like the number of people packed into this the island of, not just the island of Manhattan, but the five boroughs, so, but as far as like going down the street and the people that you see, it's similar. It's the same, in terms of like the racial diversity, and the dynamic is the same. I think, in San Antonio, I would say probably the most racially diverse city in Texas is by far Houston. That has, and therefore has a reputation of having like the best food in Texas. And I think that's probably true. Uh, you know, but yeah, I mean, it's like it used to be that you know, I sort of had this rule that I don't eat like barbecue if I'm not in the South or in Texas, or I don't um, eat Mexican food. um, you know, too far north.
Yeah.
But but I was just walking down the street the other day and I saw they have a Dallas barbecue,
Hmm.
and around the corner, and there are several legitimate looking Mexican restaurants that over there near Union Square.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of like offering authentic, Mexican food.
Hmm.
And so, at least, and Tex-Mex type, uh, food, because it's debated, like it's debatable. Like if you've actually been to Mexico, the food is different in Mexico than in, kind of the classic Tex-Mex food.
Hmm.
Um, so, and again, just in terms of, um, you know, with Long Island, I think that it's almost like the urban versus like the suburban divide. That dynamic is the same. You know, I mean,
Hmm.
yes, New York is generally considered to be a blue state, but you have you have conservatives who are, in, same thing in New Jersey. We spent a few days in New Jersey, and that there was not everybody, even in New York, even though it kind of has this, there's this, it's like stereotypes. They're easy, but they don't, like, when you actually dig around and spend some time in a place, you start to realize that they're not always they're not true in every case. So
Yeah. Yeah. The there's one thing I've heard, like when people talk about like people from Texas, that there's a pride in being from Texas that I don't think you necessarily have in New York. Like, I mean, you can be proud to be from New York, but like my sense is there's a more significant amount of pride in being a Texan and from Texas than from New York. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I would agree with that. I think that there's a mythology,
Hmm.
surrounding Texas, but again, the operative word being mythology, and uh, and I think even people in Texas, I think it's like, you kind of get, it's very easy to kind of get in your, it's such a big state, you're in your own little silo, and you think, well, I'm the only person here. It's like the guy that I met on the plane ride to Lubbock. He's like, oh, he thought, well, if you don't have an accent, then how, he couldn't believe that I was, I'd made it, however old I was, 20 years without developing, like living in Texas without developing an accent.
Hmm.
So, so I, that's, but I do think that there is a lot of, you know, that people do take a lot of pride in our state, and I think there's probably this thought that all the people that are doing that are, uh, you know, are of a certain political persuasion. But I'm telling you, I've met some people who are of the opposite persuasion who feel just as strongly about, you know, um, you know, the history of their place, and their connection to it. So that's that it there's really, it's a lot. It's not really like, going back to what you were saying before, like there's this impression that it's a monolith, but it's not.
Hmm.
you know
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate having this kind of conversation because I feel like, what the internet has done for us, like in a good way, is and I do think it's a good way in the long run, is that we are connected to almost everybody. But I think what needs to catch up is our awareness of how little we understand about things. Because right
Mhm.
now, I guess the media is funneling certain bits of information to people, right, based on the preconceptions they've already have based on prior clicks and like whatever else they've been
Yeah,
doing. And what I wanted to do with this podcast is just to get people to understand, like, there are just basic assumptions people have. Like, I'm sure if somebody pictures New York City, there's probably a lot of people who like think of like the Bronx is burning, and they think it's like
yeah,
crime ridden, run over, and it's like it's not. Are there is that part of New York City? Absolutely. Are there problems that New York City has? Absolutely. But there's a lot more going on. And like for me, when I think of Texas, when I used to think of Houston, I just thought of, I don't know, I thought of oil rigs. Like that's all I thought of.
yeah,
I don't know why. In Dallas, you
yeah,
just picture like people in cowboy boots and hats, and say like
yeah,
so you have these very monolithic caricatures and
Yeah.
stereotypes, and we're all filtering. The news is already being filtered based on those things to reinforce them. Whereas hopefully, like a podcast and talking with you, is that it starts kind of
Hmm.
broadening this stuff to understand like it's not. It's so much more than what you think it is, and I've found that we went to I took some kids to South Carolina for like the first trip of a company that I started, which named after this podcast, American Tributaries Travel. But what I found is like in every encounter, nobody is what you expect them to be. That's like a rule of thumb. So you can meet somebody wearing like a Trump supporting hat, and they're so much
Hmm.
more complicated and interesting than you thought they were. You can meet, somebody, an old retiree in Charleston, and they're not what you think they were. You meet the drill sergeant at the army base, and he's not at all what you think they were. So
Yeah.
to me, the rule of thumb is almost like whatever your caricature is, whatever your stereotype is, that's exactly what it's not.
Hmm. Yeah, no,
And
I think that's definitely true. And I think that's why it's important to kind of go travel and go outside your bubble and meet new people and go to different places. And unfortunately for a lot of people, like their ability to travel is dependent upon their ability to pay for that travel. So, not all of us are like privileged enough to do that. So and so then you can kind of but I do think there is you can always read books. I
yeah,
mean, reading is important,
yeah,
and that's a really good way because it's about developing empathy for the other group, right? So and being willing to consider a different perspective, and um, and that doesn't and not be threatened by it,
right,
so that's I think is or be fearful of it. And so I think that's what is kind of the problem with the conversations that have been having, um, and kind of where things are in our, just in terms of like people can't just have like a basic conversation with one another. But I do think like what doing it in person, where you can actually either even if it's like virtually, it's a lot easier to have those conversations because you're less likely because it's very easy. I think this is the downside of social media is that we know this about it, that it's much easier to be rude to somebody over text. Like this is why people break up with each other over text because they can't, it's very hard to like have a face-to-face conversation with someone. So, and be, rude or mean to them or whatever. So, yeah, so I think that is, makes a huge difference, when you actually see the person in front of you, then it's easier to actually have an open conversation.
yeah. Yeah, but it's funny that you're saying that gentleman in Lubbock didn't think you have an accent, and to me, you definitely still do have an accent.
Yeah, and that's and sometimes um, like I don't notice Michael's accent anymore.
Mhm.
And like when we were first together, I
Mhm.
noticed it quite a bit.
Mhm.
Or, it's just like you get used to these things.
Yeah,
And some people I've, have accused me of having some kind of Midwestern accent, and I have, most people, you don't really notice your own accent. I mean, there was a lady on the street that my daughter and I were standing next to, and um, my daughter liked the outfit. She was an older lady, and she was wearing white, Converse high tops, and she was very smartly dressed. She had a long sleeve like linen shirt on and pants, which is you know, actually what you should wear in warm weather, like to protect yourself from the sun. And so we kind of struck up a conversation with her, and she was like, "You're not from around here, are you?" And I was like, "No, we're from San Antonio." So she knew right away, like that we were local.
yeah.
So,
um,
but I mean, who in New York is local, right? It's a
yeah.
city of immigrants. So
Well,
we're
Well, this hit me when we were down in South Carolina, but I think in terms of like, I guess having this platform to kind of explain like New York is one of the things we noticed in South Carolina, and it sounds similar to Texas, is that there's a certain kind of mythology and history, and there's a certain tradition, there's a certain rootedness that people have in those areas. That's very different than New York. New York is a city of like transients, right? So like you
Yeah.
don't have and the beauty is that you can come to New York and you could be stepping off the train, stepping off the airplane, and you already are a New Yorker, because New York is more than most other places. I think more about attitude, and not just like the
Yes.
caricature of an attitude. It's just more of like a comfort, a like just in a certain level of open mindedness. Because I readily acknowledge that there's not an open mindedness in every direction, which is why I'm trying to do this. But there's that, and there's a certain energy that people have, and that's very unique now. But I think what that also means is that you're always constantly looking to kind of change tradition. You're almost like, the way to break out, the way to make more money, the way to succeed, the way to be noticed is to do something different in a city of
Yeah.
7 million, 8 million. So you're always challenging the history, you're always challenging the tradition, and that's what kind of breaks you ahead. That's what gets you noticed, is not being beholden to the tradition. So it's always constantly being kind of reinvented in some ways, and that makes it, in understanding the rest of the country, sometimes I think a bit like New Yorkers. I feel like I'm trying to, like, I don't know, like, we live in a very unique bubble, and we have to understand that the rest of the world doesn't operate like us. And one of those, I think, is that idea of like tradition and history. It just works differently here than in a lot of other places. And when we are looking outward at the rest of the country, we need to be cognizant of that different paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that you can find pockets of that in other places. I think especially like to me, in terms of like, I do feel like, well, especially after 9/11, like there was a pride that, in new, that, uh, you know, that to me rivals like what anything that would be coming out of any other state, including Texas. And so I mean that I think was kind of a defining moment, for the city, and I actually think that actually kind of, you know just that whole time period afterwards, that it there was more of a connection that the rest of the country felt with New York. And so, it would be nice if we could feel that feel that way about every state, whether or not, depending on where you're living, because, and it wouldn't necessarily need to take a tragedy for that to happen. And, but I, that's the thing. It's like, we're all in this together kind of thing. And that's really the way, that attitude is what I think needs to be cultivated, because, you can't just assume that what is happening in one place is not going to affect, uh, what's happening in your backyard either. So, yeah. So, I mean, I think that, that, that yes, it's definitely, something that is relatable, even though you're like, I wouldn't, could never live here, no matter what your attitude is. Like, I'll come visit the place, but I don't see how people do it. But then if you actually do come and live here, which I've kind of been living here for, temporarily for the last week, you can understand, why some of the conveniences, and why people put up with some of the other inconveniences, so that's also something that is helpful. And again, like being in the military, a lot of people do have to like go and move and, live in different places, and then that sort of helps. I mean, there's pros and cons to that, but one of the pros is that you do kind of, you have, it's like, you're kind of getting a taste of different places, and you're less likely, and you're better able to understand, okay, what are we doing this for again? This defense of the nation thing, what are we defending? It becomes a little bit more meaningful to you.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
So,
the thing I guess that I've been trying to use is like I call it like the three virtues or whatever of like kind of like using curiosity, respect, and compassion, and like wherever you go and wherever you visit. And
mhm,
honestly, like I just I came up with that in the last few months, but totally guilty of not following those. But I think that to me is like the true like. I guess what we should all aspire to is to be able to go into any setting and be like, okay, I see what people like about here. I see the problems, I see the great things. You don't have to necessarily want to live there, but you should at least
mhm.
leave with an understanding of how people live and
Yeah,
why some people might like it. It doesn't have to be your cup of tea. Certainly not. New York City is it's insane to live here for many reasons, but
yeah.
it
But then there's also some really, I mean, I understand why people are like, I don't want to leave. You know, so, some of my in-laws, they've lived here their whole life, and they can't imagine living anywhere else. So, it's because it's their home.
right.
It's where they've lived their whole life. And so, I mean, I've never lived outside of Texas, and I mean, it's not that that I wouldn't have considered it. It's just it was never something that ever materialized,
Mm,
in terms of, that it had to, it worked out that way. But, so I think there's that, everybody has their connection to their home base, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, you definitely, I do like that whole, that's a really good, little, personal mission statement to have, because I do think that, especially the compassion part.
yeah.
I mean, everybody's, some people have differing levels of curiosity,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I think in terms of like having compassion, I think that there's a general lack of that, that it's very, that is what kind of just, perpetuates the animosity between different groups,
Yeah.
is that, so I think that's really, that's good. I like that.
Thanks. And I think and I think both of them to me they both kind of go hand in hand because if you're just if you just give somebody respect without compassion, it's like you're acknowledging the good things, but you don't care about the bad things.
Hmm.
And then I think, and to me, like also like, and if you don't have compassion or either, sometimes just gloating, like bad things happening, like
Yes.
New York City suffering and pandemic, so we'll gloat about that. But could also be the other way. It could be New Yorkers who are upset about whatever thing they read about Texas politics and they see like a winter storm, the winter storm's like, well, serves them right for having that crazy governor or whatever. Like
Yeah.
that's the something that like you could see yourself slipping into that. And I think that to me is why they're both important because it's important to respect, but it's also important
Yeah.
to like realize there are bad things and that you want to help the bad things, not just kind of like look at them indifferently.
Yeah, you really have to be careful, I think, when you do things like that, because karma does, I mean, it's in every, that concept of karma, what goes around comes around, you reap what you sow. That all, that's like a real thing, because it's, we're dealing with the human condition, living on this planet, you know, this idea that that it couldn't happen to you, or and that it's unproductive
Mm.
to engage in that, because eventually, one of the things that it's like, we may look different, we may have differing income levels, but we all have a similar, like, gut response to certain things, because we all have the same psychology to a certain extent,
Yeah.
and a lot of that is, depending on what, how, are the families that we grow up in, that by and large kind of, and determines sort of, the worldview that we form. And so that's why, and there is a variety, of expressions, and in terms of, like, human beings. And so, those are all things that we have, like, how do you, that's one of the things that's so interesting about, this country is that, in other countries that are a little bit more like that are really monoliths, like some, European countries, some, pretty much every other country on the planet. I mean, that is not really technically, I mean, like maybe with the exception of Canada, that's not really a nation of immigrants. You are having like, that's part of, like, we actually do have to work out our differences, and that's something that a lot of other places, if you're like, well, why haven't we been able to solve some of these problems that we're having? Well, that's kind of like, the best thing about us. And then it's also kind of like, it can be kind of like a curse, I mean, just in terms of, but, I don't know, there's hope, I think. There's
well,
definitely hope.
well,
I think if we can sort of like, okay, these are the basic things that we all agree on, that of how we're going to treat one another. And I think that's what's worth defending, and so that if you're like trying to figure out, okay, is this behavior out of bounds, or or not, in terms of what's coming, out of your, the people who are in charge, like that's a good place to start,
mm, yeah,
so.
yeah. Well, you actually touched upon the question I like to finish all these interviews with, which is what gives you hope at the end of the day.
What keeps me up at
what gives you hope?
what gives me hope?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. For me, I mean, this is kind of cheesy, but my kids, I do think that, like, I do look at my kids, and I do feel like they are much more. Um, I'm always surprised at how open-minded they are in terms of, they're a new generation, and I do think that there is something to be said in terms of they have evolved in a certain way. Like I feel like my kids have accomplished definitely a lot more than I have at their age, than I had, and so, so I would say they're the ones that give me hope. I mean, I feel like, I don't know, some people are, really concerned about like all the screen time and stuff like that, but I mean, they just are, I look at them and I think, it's going to be, it'll be fine. If you just keep, as long as they have, I mean, like, I feel like, my job is to provide like a strong support base, and then, whatever else happens after that, it's going to be okay. But that's what I would say gives me hope, is that I look at like these, my daughter and my son and their friends, and I think, the cycle will continue. It may not be, what any of us can think of, but who knows what it's going to look like. But I do think that they're the ones that I really feel like are going to, carry us through the next, each generation. So
That's great.
yeah, we're kind of like in that, we're in the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah,
So,
right.
you and I,
Yeah.
and you do start to see that you know, you kind of like, you will eventually be replaced by others. So that's what gives me hope.
It's good they're so close to home. All
Yeah.
right. Well, Kat, thanks so much for joining me. This has been a lot of fun. I'm so glad we could
Well,
do
thank
this.
you for having me, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. All
All
right. Well,
right.
enjoy the rest of your time in New York.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.